Henry! Henry! Where is he? All day I haven't seen him. Henry!
Yes, Miss Liza?
Henry, I need water. Please fetch me some water.
There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole.
Then mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then mend it, dear Henry, dear Henry, mend it.
With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, with what?
With some straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With some straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, some straw.
But the straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long.
Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, cut it.
With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what?
With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, an axe.
But the axe is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. The axe is too dull, dear Liza, too dull.
Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, sharpen it.
With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what?
With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, a stone.
But the stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry.
Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, wet it.
With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what?
With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, water.
But I have no water, dear Liza, dear Liza. And I have no water, dear Liza. I have none.
Then fetch it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then fetch it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fetch it.
With what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fetch it, dear Liza? With what?
With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, the bucket.
But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza.
Ah.